Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel Helvering, and I am in community engagement at the Tennessee State Museum, and we are thrilled to have you joining us virtually. A couple things before we hand it off to our speaker. If you would just make sure you are muted. At the bottom of your screen, there's a little bar with some different options, and there's a microphone. Just make sure the microphone has a line through it, please. Every once in a while, you can get unmuted and it causes some interference. If you have any questions, tech questions, or questions for our speaker, feel free to send those to us in the chat bar. Also at the bottom of your screen, probably down in the bottom right corner is a little chat bubble. You can pull that up. Please address any questions to all panelists. That way we can there we go. That way we can all see your questions as they come in. My screen's being funky. But if you choose that, we can all see them. We'll answer your questions, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. And then as you came in, you might have noticed our screen about our newsletter. If you're not signed up for our virtual newsletter, please do so. We'll drop the link in the chat bar, and you can sign up online. That just gives you a quick overview of what we're doing each week. It'll send you the information on luncheons learns like the one we have today and other programming. So we highly encourage you, if you're not already signed up, please sign up for our newsletter. But without further ado from us, let's get our wonderful speaker. Miss LaDonna Brown is here with us, and she is from Oklahoma. We were talking about the bad weather they were experiencing yesterday. And she works for the Chickasaw National Cultural Resources Department. She's a tribal archaeologist. She's also part of the Chickasaw Nation dance troupe, which I find amazing. Makes beaded art and baskets, and is here to talk to us today with this wonderful PowerPoint. So help me virtually welcome her. And LaDonna, you are ready to go.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to showing me in this spot, and I'm going to try to turn that off. Okay, I don't know, that'll work, whatever it did. It's funny.
It looks good on our end. I know they all look different.
Yeah. Okay. My name is Chugma Sohojifoet LaDonna Brown. Micha Chikasha Iyagni Toxalili Chikasha Saya. Hello, my name is LaDonna Brown, and I serve as the Director of Research and Cultural Interpretation in the Heritage Preservation Division at the Chickasaw Nation. I am Chickasaw. I appreciate the opportunity to share our Chickasaw culture and history with you today. The title of my presentation is From Ancient Past to Modern Day in the Chickasaw Homeland. Let's see. So when we talk about our homeland, when our ancestors lived in our homeland, they established their own type of lifestyle. Lifestyle can be thought of as culture, and it consists of activities that we participate on a daily basis with our communities. And those types of things are such things as the oral history that we share with our community, that we hand down from generation to generation. And that can be such things as our creation story and our migration story. It also contains such things as the types of houses that we lived in, the types of clothing that we wore, the types of weapons that we made, the language that we spoke, and the foods that we hunted and that we gathered and we used for ceremonial and traditional purposes. Our history spans thousands of years and is shared with us from our ancestors. So if we put the Chickasaw history on a timeline, the timeline might be constructed as what's on this screen. And the timeline might be such things as our creation story, which has no date, our migration story, which has no date, and then we might think of the archaeological stages. And the archaeological stages basically begins according to archaeologists in the Southeast 12,000 years ago. For Southeastern anthropologists and archaeologists, we bump that time just a little bit earlier to 15,000 years ago. But along the archaeology and the archaeological field, we understand that to be 12,000 years ago. So it started somewhere around 12,000 BC and lasted all the way up to 1400 AD. And then we can think of European exploration, which occurred for the Chickasaw beginning in 1540 and lasting up to 1700. And then we can think of colonial history kind of overlapping that European exploration from about 1670 to 1776. And then, of course, for American history beginning in this country, American history begins at 1776. Now, I know that there may be a little bit of debate on that. We may think of American history as beginning a lot earlier than that. But we know that for all our intents and purposes, when the Chickasaws began interacting with the Americans, we began interacting with the Americans in 1786, but we know that they were established in 1776. So, once again, we're looking at the Chickasaw timeline of history. And then we can think of our forced removal, the forced removal of Chickasaw people from our homeland, beginning in 1837. The first group left in 1837, and people were trickling to Indian Territory all the way up to 1890. When the concepts of Chickasaw history and lifestyle are blended, and understanding of cultural identity is made clear and provides for insight to a very early time when these cultural characteristics are established. Together, these concepts can help understand how a cultural identity has survived to this modern day. So first we start with Chickasaw oral history. Chickasaw oral history begins with our creation story, and the next story would be our migration story. And these stories are handed down through generations of people from an ancient past, from thousands of years ago, and they are still stories that we hold today, that we still hand down to future generations of Chickasaw, of course, to our kids. And so hopefully that will be handed down to future generations of Chickasaw people. A timeline helps to navigate through an early past by referring to archaeological time periods and will lead to the point of contact of European explorers. So archaeological cultural categories are known as the Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian. A nomadic existence with people who hunted large megafauna, made stone tools, and understood a simple type of social organization is revealed by the Paleo-Indian cultural period. The tools are part of a toolkit that evolved through the time periods and provides the changes in lifestyle. In the Archaic cultural period, changes of the lifestyle due to environmental fluctuations caused the toolkit to evolve. A change in the social organization also occurred, and a spiritual understanding was seen through the carving of stone effigies. The Woodland cultural period is represented by a change in the living style of these ancestors. Our ancestors constructed and lived in stationary houses and created agricultural fields. Their toolkit evolved to include tools to produce gardens as well as weapons. As this primitive type, at this time, primitive types of basketry and pottery are constructed, which are also found in the archaeological record. As their toolkit improved, populations of people increased. This particular picture is an artist rendition of a pre-contact community, or a type of community right before the Europeans stepped foot into our communities. People were buried in communal mounds, and exotic trade goods were buried with them. An exotic trade good is basically an item made from non-local material. At this particular time, there's evidence that the trade network began to increase. As all of these cultural features are established, archaeologists and anthropologists saw a rise to civilization and noted that it had been initiated. Anthropologists declare that the highest form of civilization on this continent is found during the Mississippian cultural period located within the Southeast. The Mississippian cultural period is characterized by flat-top mounds, large agricultural fields, large defensive palisade walls made for protection from neighboring warring groups, world-class artwork, a manifestation of complex spirituality, and most of all, transition to a complex political organization. From this amazing background, the Southeastern Indian tribes' cultural characteristics emerge. Hold on one second. I got a little confused in my of where I am. So we saw the pre-contact community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. After the Mississippian cultural stage, the pre-contact or protohistoric stage is revealed, which indicates the time right before the Europeans stepped foot on this continent. The protohistoric stage reveals major cultural characteristics, some of which are found in clothing, songs, dances, language, settlement patterns, and games our ancestors played. And these are characteristics we have recreated in a living village. Some of the cultural characteristics that will be discussed are the settlement pattern of the community. And in this artist rendition of a pre-contact community, you can see how the houses are laid out in that settlement. This is very similar with the mound settlement pattern. So in the Mississippian time period, we talk about mounds that are built during that time. For some reason, there was a decline in the Mississippian mound builder people, and when that society declined, or when that culture declined, then what we do see is this village layout, or the settlement pattern, that you don't have all of these large mounds. You have a more flat type of settlement pattern. There's a large agricultural fields, and as you can see in this picture, there's a large agricultural fields. You can tell the houses are stationary. You don't move these houses around. And this is very important to understand about the Chickasaw people, is that our settlements were stationary. There was lots and lots of trees, as you know, where you live in the Nashville area. You know, our homeland was just to the west of there. There's lots and lots of trees in the area. There's no reason for us to follow migrating herds of animals. Everything lives right where we lived. So what we did was build a community there that built a settlement pattern, and then people would travel outward from that area, and they would hunt, and they would gather plants and bring those back to this settlement area. There was no reason for us to build houses that were not stationary. So the houses that we built were stationary. When we built two different types of houses, we had winter homes and summer homes. And as you know, in Nashville and in the Southeast, it can be very, very hot in the summertime. And so our houses were built to accommodate that type of atmosphere. You also know that it gets very cold in the wintertime. I mean, it can get below freezing. It can be very cold for people there. And so you have to have a type of house that can be good for the environment. And so you'll see some of these houses that have very thick walls. Those are known as our winter houses. So they're very important for the atmosphere in that area. And you see a major water source. Major water sources were like our highways. They were how we traveled from one community to another. We had these huge canoes that we would travel on the water. And one of the things that we ask ourselves about the canoes is, if the canoes were just as busy as our highways are today, what kind of traffic signals would these people in the canoes have, on the waterways, because you have really, really long canoes, and you might have really, really small canoes, fishermen, two people, riding along in a canoe, in a small canoe, and then you have this really huge canoe that's being, paddled down the middle of the river by lots of oarsmen. Maybe they're going, to a war with somebody else or to battle with somebody else. What is that kind of right of way for, canoe people in canoes on these waterways? So, that's something that's been lost, but, it would be really interesting to, to know what that was like way back then. Another thing that you'll see is that there is a large cleared out area. We refer that as the plaza area. And the plaza area was used for social activities. And social activities would be such things as once the people came off the waterways, maybe they had items that they wanted to trade, items that they had received from, way far off. And so they would come to the plaza area and they'd set up a little booth, and people would come out, start trading with different things that they would have. Also, we had to have a place to do our ceremonies and to have feasts, and just to have, for people to play games, to have social activities. And so that's the place where you see this large cleared out area. You also see that there is a large palisade fence. There's a fence that goes between the community and the agricultural field. And back in this early time, people were already trying to create large kingdoms or large chiefdoms. And by doing that, they would, maybe attack somebody, maybe if they were unaware, and another group would attack the other one, so that they could create a larger chiefdom or a larger kingdom. And of course, when you do that, then you have, access to the best trade goods, the best trade routes, the best foods, everything that helps to make people, more wealthy. And that's what a trade economy does. And this was established long before Europeans came to this continent. And so we need to think about this trade route, this trade network exists all over this country. And it is a mechanism by which these Southeastern Indians believed, and they worked within that trade route to make it very successful, and to make it successful for their communities. So as they created this network, and it's well established, once the first Europeans get here, Europeans understood trade, they understood economy. Once they learned the mechanisms by which Southeastern trade networks worked, then they became also entranced in that trade network. But we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about how Europeans really needed that trade network in order to survive on this continent. So the types of clothing that our ancestors would have worn in our homeland is made from the main material, which are deer skins. For Southeastern Indian men would wear these breechcloths, and this is just a summertime attire in the community, and that's all that they would wear. That's all that they needed to wear. And like I said, in the summertime in the South, you know it gets really hot, so that's what the men were wearing. For women, the women would wear either a animal skin or plant material, a skirt made out of plant material. So they would actually take plant materials and they would weave those, and they would weave garments out of those plant materials. It's just like if you have cotton, you know, you take cotton and you pick the cotton and you take all the seeds out, and then you begin to make it into fibers like yarn, and the word is escaping me, but you make it into fibers and you start weaving it into something, and so that's what these women did with these plant materials, and so they made skirts out of those. And like I said, for the environment in the South, it's very hot, so the women would wear these animal skin skirts. But of course, for the wintertime, we know it gets really cold there. We know it snows. So for the men would add more articles of clothing, and so they would add such things as moccasins and leggings. And then when they would add a animal skin type shirt, they would brain tan deer hides, and they would leave the fur on the one side, and they would take two of those and lace them together, leaving the deer hide or the deer fur on the inside, and then the part that they tanned on the outside, and it would make a really warm, comfortable shirt. But they didn't know anything about putting sleeves on those shirts, so they had this kind of vest type of outfit or shirt. They would add a animal skin cloak over that shirt to guard against the really cold weather. For the women would make these full-length skin dresses made out of deer hides. They would brain tan those, and they would add it would go over one shoulder and under the other arm. And so here's a picture of this type of deer hide dress that our ancestors would have worn. Of course, they would have added moccasins and leggings, and then an animal skin cloak over her shoulders in the winter and in the very cold weather. The sketches that we see of this clothing comes from the 16th century, and it was drawn by a Frenchman by the name of Lepage de Pratz. Our ancestors made several types of tools and weapons. The types of tools and weapons that they would have made was a spear thrower, which we also know as an atlatl. But there's a problem sometimes with terminology, and sometimes that terminology confuses people. So in our living village at the Chickasaw Cultural Center, we were demonstrating the spear and the atlatl. But using the term atlatl comes from, I guess, from a South American term, not sure. And people, visitors, tourists to our living village thought that we were connected somehow with the South American Indians who used spears and atlatls. And we're like, you know, there's no connection. You know, we're not relatives. We didn't migrate up from South America. There's no connection. So we had to change that so that people could understand that we use spears and spear throwers just like the South American Indians do. I mean, I don't know if they still use them. I know that they use blowguns, but same concept, totally different people. For this early time, some of the points that are found on these spears are known as Clovis points. And then, of course, some of the later weapon was the bow and arrow. And like I mentioned earlier, that we did have the blowgun and the dart for the blowgun. We also had another weapon or tool known as a hunting stick. Usually little boys would use the hunting stick, and they would go out and they would kill rabbits and birds and squirrels with the hunting stick. And it looks basically like a club, but you stand a few yards back, you throw the hunting stick at the animal, and usually it injures it enough for you to run up and grab it. And for the little boys were learning to sharpen their skills as they hunted these animals. And so they would be able to contribute to the meals. So the schooling and education for our young, for our children, especially for the boys, to learn how to be really good hunters and to how to become very good warriors. Their training began usually about the time when they started walking and started playing, had toys. We would give them, you know, little play toy bow and arrows and play toy hunting sticks. And then by the time they're 5 and 6 years old and they're out on maybe on the outside of the community of the village, and they're in the woods right around the village, you know, those are some little things that they could hunt. So those are some of the types of tools and weapons that our ancestors would have made. Our language is from a larger language family. The language family is known as the Muskogean language family, and the Chickasaws speak our own dialect of this larger language family. So to give you an idea of what our language sounds like, and of course our language has been spoken here for, you know, at least 15,000 years, probably longer than that. So it's a very old language, and anthropologists tell us that probably at least for 30,000 years, this language has been spoken on this continent. So to give you an idea of what our language sounds like, I'll say these animals for you. Deer is Issy, rabbit is Chokfi, wolf is Neshoba, squirrel is Funny, and raccoon is Showy. There are several different types of foods that our ancestors would have hunted, that they would have gathered, and all of these foods are things that you guys would be totally familiar with. And these foods, you know, basically are foods that are familiar in Southern cuisine. Some of the main animals that our ancestors would have hunted was bear, deer, and turkey. And our ancestors did lots of fishing for, you know, there's lots of water sources in our homelands, and so they did lots and lots of fishing. They also collected lots of vegetables that are located in our homeland. The vegetables are such things as, the wild plants would be such things as wild potatoes, wild onions, lamb's quarters, and a host of many other different things that they would have gathered. But these are some things that we are familiar with, well, that Chickasaw people are familiar with today. I don't think that, anybody else goes out and gathers wild potatoes or the wild onions or the lamb's quarters, but we still gather the wild onions and the lamb's quarters and still cook those and eat those. And those have been here for, we see them in the archaeological record all the way back to the woodland period. And these have Chickasaw names. Let's see, potatoes is ahi, onions is imitha, I forget. And then of course there's lamb's quarters. And then of course our ancestors had large agricultural fields that was created in the woodland time period. And the main crops that were planted there in those large agricultural fields are corn, beans, and squash. Corn, beans, and squash were always planted together, and they became known as the Three Sisters. Corn, beans, and squash are very old. Corn is known as tunchi, beans is bala, and squash is obi. There's lots of fruits in our homelands that, wild fruits in our homelands that our ancestors could have gathered. Some of them are such things as wild grapes, wild plums, wild strawberries, cherries, and other delicious fruits, blackberries, strawberries, a number of different things that they would have been able to gather. And these are things that you guys would, if we would have made a dish for you even today and set it before you and you're like, what's this? And we're like, oh, that's grape dumplings. And what's this? And this is pashofa, which is, basically corn and pork. So it's things that you would be totally familiar with. There were many types of tree nuts that they gathered, such as pecans, walnuts, acorns, hickory nuts, all kinds of different types of things. And there were many types of tree nuts to gather from the woods, and this abundance was one of the main reasons our ancestors began to build stationary houses. All of these foods are not rare, exotic kinds of animals or plants, but they are items that we can find today in the woods. And, if we were able to go, if me and in my group here in the office, if we were able to go and gather all these plants and the meats, and then we were able to prepare them, we would definitely have a feast. This particular map is a map of early Chickasaw communities. And when our ancestors lived in our historic homeland, you can see the settlement patterns that extended throughout the area that we now know as Tupelo, Mississippi. Our connection to this land is revealed in our oral history, but most importantly, we have a spiritual connection to the land. Our ancestors first encountered Hernando de Soto and his conquistadors in 1540, according to Spanish documentary sources. After the Spanish left our territory, not much recorded information was revealed for approximately 100 years. And then at the end of the 17th century, records regarding our ancestors documented interaction with the French and English. Many historic accounts have been told and retold through our history, and those have been recorded through European documentation. As a historical connection is made from our ancient past to the modern day, information about how implementation of modern day connections will now be discussed. So here's another map, and this is the map of the Chickasaw historic homeland. This, these boundaries are revealed by what was disclosed to U.S. government officials in our meeting with them at the Treaty of Hopewell Conference held in 1786 at Franklin, Tennessee. And our ancestors, our leaders, told these government officials where our homeland boundaries were located. The government officials sent out government surveyors, and their surveyors surveyed these homeland boundaries that our ancestors told them where they were. And so this is the information that was revealed on a map. As you can see, our historic homelands consist of Southwest Kentucky, West Central Tennessee, North Mississippi, and North Alabama. As you can see, the forced ceded lands are also located on this map and the years when those forced cessions took place. With the reconnection to our homeland, in addition to oral and documented accounts, true narrative of our culture that was developed and established in our homeland can be made known. Information from our oral history is communicated by our Chickasaw Nation offices located in Mississippi. Those offices are known as the Chickasaw Archaeology and Field Study Office and Homeland Affairs. The Homeland Affairs team also partner with the Chickasaw and Kana Foundation in protecting, preserving, and interpreting our ancestors' historic homeland sites. Our team includes archaeologists, cultural interpreters, maintenance workers, and administration. Developing strong relationships by working with city, state, and federal agencies, we participate in cultural resource investigations, natural and cultural resource management of regional Chickasaw, Southeastern Indian, or general First American interpretation and educational programming. Cultural interpreters present information about Chickasaw removal, Chickasaw history, and by providing programming at local schools, festivals, and other special events, including educational tours. One thing that I might mention right now, just kind of as a note, here at the Chickasaw Nation, rather than using the term Native American, we use the term First American. It is a term that was coined by the museum, a museum that's being built here in the state of Oklahoma that's going to tell the story of the 39 tribes that are located here in the state of Oklahoma. And so the name of the museum is First American Museum. And so it is a term that we have begun to use. Rather than using Native American, we use First American. The Chickasaw Archaeology and Field Study Director has developed a few programs which benefit individuals by teaching about the field of archaeology and providing a hands-on experience relating to our ancient and historic sites. One of these programs is the Chickasaw Archaeological Survey Program. The Chickasaw Archaeological and Field Study has collaborated with universities to investigate Chickasaw battlefields on settlements, and much information has been gained from these partnerships. One of our primary responsibilities is the preservation and management of our history. For the Homeland Affairs sites in the Homeland, they manage 3 sites: Chickasaw, which is also known as the Chickasaw Preserve, the Kunawa Cabin, which is located along the Kunawa Ridge, and the Fox Trap Site, which is a large site that is found in northwest Alabama. We are very fortunate to build on this connection to our historic homeland in this modern day. Some objectives for these offices located in the homeland are to serve as a channel for heritage tourism, provide jobs for the local community, and build relationships with groups and agencies by providing educational programs, tours, or other educational need required by the community. Today, an opportunity exists where we can discuss the area where our culture was created and who the ancient people were that constructed these basic elements of our cultural identity. And in conclusion, through oral history, we are told of the beginning of our existence and how we were directed to our historic homeland. The manifestations of our early existence is provided through items our ancestors made, such as houses, clothing, tools and weapons, language, and food. We rely on our language to understand this very early time. We retain knowledge of, prepare, and cook the same foods as our ancestors. We, to a certain degree, still practice the ancient matrilineal social structure in our households. We understand the kinship and clan affiliation, even though those concepts are not strongly relied upon today. This is how our cultural identity is passed down from an ancient past to the modern day in the Chickasaw homeland. Thank you for letting me present this information for the Lunch and Learn series of the Tennessee State Museum. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask at this time.
That was amazing, LaDonna. Thank you so much. We do have a couple questions.
Okay.
I have questions of my own, so I'm very excited. I have the power now to ask them. But a couple
Sure.
from our audience. Somebody asked what year the clothing was from that you demonstrated. Is that a specific time frame that those are examples of?
We can just say that this particular clothing is pre-contact.
Awesome. Another person wants to know, they said they grew up being told that they had Chickasaw ancestors. Any tips on how they could verify that or find out if it's true? They said those ancestors have passed away, so they're not sure how to proceed.
Oh, yeah. Not sure about how to prove that. If you're not here in what was known as Indian Territory and then become the state of Oklahoma, because all of the records and everything for the Chickasaw people basically was determined to who was going to be Chickasaw by those records that were established here in Oklahoma, basically by the Dawes Act, the General Allotment Act back in 1890. So, you know, if your ancestors weren't here during that time and got on that role, then it'd be really hard to determine that. I mean, I guess you'd probably have to do DNA and that sort of thing. And so the DNA would, and you have that story in your family that you're a Chickasaw, then that might, give you, good proof, good evidence that you are Chickasaw.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
That's about it. Okay. Thank you. Somebody else just said amazing presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Emily wants to know if you could talk a little bit more about your creation story.
Basically, our creation story, which has been handed down, it was translated from Chickasaw into English. So it loses a whole lot of that really basic cultural information that you need to understand it to give it kind of that background. But basically, what it is that that our ancestors understood that at one time this area was a large watery area, that there was no land, and that a crawfish went down to the bottom of this water and brought up mud. And when the crawfish brought up mud, the creator, what we refer to as Ababenili, a spirit being, sitting above, created the world out of this mud that was brought up by the crawfish. And he created the Chickasaw, first man and woman, out of this mud and put them on this large mud ball to dry. And the crawfish and the birds, it wasn't drying fast enough. And so the raven decided to help. And so the raven flew around this mud ball. And where he dipped his wings made the valleys. And where he brought his wings up, it made the mountains. And eventually everything dried up, and the first Chickasaw man and woman lived in this area. And according to our migration story, this began somewhere in the west. So we were created somewhere in the west. We don't know exactly where, but eventually we had to migrate from that area to the southeast.
That's fantastic. We got a question. Somebody asked if the event is being recorded, and it is, and it'll be up on our YouTube channel and on the website. So you can look for the State Museum YouTube or look at the videos on our State Museum website. But we got two questions about historic sites and archaeological sites in West Tennessee or Northern Alabama. Are there any that you can visit? And has the Chickasaw Nation helped in the preservation of those sites?
A lot of times those archaeological sites were discovered, at a very early stage to now. So some of those were created like, maybe in the 40s, maybe in the 70s. So one of the places that I can think of is Pinson Mounds. We definitely say that we are connected to Pinson Mounds, and so it's definitely a place located within the center of our Chickasaw homeland, our historic homeland. And so we do bring Chickasaw people to Pinson Mounds to visit a woodland period mound site. And the reason is because a lot of our cultural characteristics come out of that particular time period. Things that we still create now. Basketry came out of the woodland time period. We have people who still make baskets now. Pottery came out of the woodland time period. We still make pottery now. So if you go to Pinson Mounds, you'll see basketry and pottery on display in the exhibits. And so we definitely claim connection there. We claim connection to Moundville, which is located in Alabama. So those types of places, archaeological sites, and those types of places were found at a later time, usually in the 20th century. But we also claim connection to them because, our ancestors were those people who created those items, way back thousands of years ago.
All right, maybe our last question. Were children separated from their families and sent to specialized school to eliminate their language and customs from the Chickasaw Nation?
Yeah, definitely. Our ancestors really needed schooling for our kids, because we realized once the Europeans got here, got connected with the trade network, we realized that once we got connected that way with the Europeans, there was no turning back. You couldn't go back to a traditional way of life. I mean, if you have a stone knife compared to a metal knife, and your stone knife breaks all the time when you're trying to apply pressure to cut things, you don't want to use that. You can use a metal knife, apply pressure, it's not going to break. So there's no turning back for our culture in the 18th century. So we realized that we needed education to become more competitive with people from the outside world, people from outside of this continent. However, the Americans wanted to send the missionaries to help educate Indian people, but we were totally against the missionaries because we had our own spirituality. We had our own understanding of spirituality. We didn't need somebody else's idea of religion or spirituality. We just needed the basics of education. And the United States federal government would not let that happen. They said if you had a missionary come in, you had to have the religion also taught to the children. And so eventually, when we got to Indian Territory, we did have schools, we did have the missionaries come in, but then there were orphanages. And so once the orphanages was created, the one thing that the United States wanted to do was separate the children from the families, and the children at very young ages, 3, 4, and 5. And can you imagine a child that you have that is taken away to an orphanage at 3 years old, and you never see that child ever again? And the child comes back and they can't speak the language, they don't know anything about the culture. What do you do with that child? You're strangers to each other. And so that's one of the situations that happened in Indian Territory. But it's another aspect of the story. So what we can do is, possibly at another time, we could come back and talk about what happened after removal. And I think that would be really interesting for you guys, because you guys kind of understand our civilizations in our homeland, but nobody knows that story about what happened after we left.
Absolutely.
So,
and we actually are getting some good questions. But I got one more I'm going to throw at you, because I think people are curious. Somebody asked, how common is it that Chickasaw language is spoken today? And she said, for example, I understand it's hard to find teachers to speak Cherokee because it was so squelched. So is it still around? Is it taught in the Chickasaw Nation?
Oh yeah, definitely. We do have major language programs. However, like I said, in the 19th century and early 20th century, we had those orphanages where they separated the children from the parents. And once they separated the children from the parents, a lot of Chickasaw people didn't speak the language. They just didn't learn it. And so right now in the Chickasaw language, I think in the Chickasaw Nation, we have over 60,000 members, but there are only 40 fluent speakers left. Mm-hmm. And those are people who learned it as their first language and then learned English as their second language. And they had to learn English the hard way because they were sent to school. They were made to be sent to school. Once they got to school, then they had to just learn English the best way they could. But some of our speakers, some of our fluent speakers said they had some really good teachers at school who were really patient and would really help them to learn English. And you don't hear that kind of story from other tribes. People get their mouths washed out with soap for speaking their language, you know, for getting beat for speaking their language. So you don't hear about teachers actually taking time out and, you know, holding a glass of water up and say, you know, glass, you know, water, and have the kids repeat it back. You never hear of that. And we do have some people who say that they did have some good speakers. And so, and they learned English really well. I mean, they speak, you know, like the rest of us, you know, the Southern dialect, you know, the Southern drawl that we have.
For sure. That's 40 out of 60,000, you said?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's tremendous. Wonderful. Well, I feel like we could keep asking you questions all day, but we won't do that. We're going to respect your time. Thank you so much for being with us virtually. This was really fantastic. Lots of people are thanking you in the chat bar.
Right.
So thank you, thank you, thank you. And to our viewers, we linked a survey. If you would fill that out, it is very short. It takes about 60 seconds. It helps us figure out what kind of programs you would like to see. If you want to see part 2 of Miss Brown, please write that in there. Let us know what kind of programming you're wanting, because we would love to hear from you. And next month we will have, for our June Lunch and Learn, 2 of our own curators at the museum talking about our latest exhibit about Tennessee's 225th birthday. So please join us in June. And LaDonna, thank you again, and we'll talk soon. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome.
Everybody have a great day.